fear and a shaking body, asked the protagonist to spare him. The Amorph, with a calm look, quickly struck him with his tail. He threw a piece of his flesh aside with great force. The protagonist, looking forward, thought that this was logical. The detonator was attached to the second heart on the right. Apparently, it was activated not by a signal, but by a strong blow. The second heart controls the side effects of genetic modification. Did Elchin really want to take the protagonist with him, knowing that he would die anyway if he was damaged? The Amorphous, taking the detonator in his hands, thought that it would take time to disassemble it. I wonder if he will like the genes of a strong mutant? The amoeba loudly addressed him by his nickname. The protagonist, sitting on the boss's body, said in her language that he told her to hide. The amoeba, rapidly jumping towards him, loudly said that danger would happen soon. The Amorphous looked towards her and asked in her language, "Why is that?" He looked ahead in horror, foreseeing the future. The flame tore the amoeba apart, and the protagonist quickly ran towards it. He ran angrily towards the powerful flame, and his body was torn to pieces. The Amorphous, with amazement on his face, stopped foreseeing and let go of the detonator. He quickly looked to the side and thought that this was very bad. The protagonist picked up the amoeba and ran forward from a powerful stream of flame. Sai-Hyan walked forward and said that he dodged it. She, with a smile on her face, clenched her hand into a fist and asked, "Is this a prediction of the future? Where did it come from?" Sai-Hyan really wants to know this. The Amorphous thought that he wanted to deal with her last, but she came to him herself. The protagonist, looking forward with tension, thought that a shiny blade was sticking out of her hands. Sai-Hyan has the gene of the White Galaran, mixed with the genes of other high-level creatures. Dozens of visible genetic features. The Amorphous is no match for her now. It is as if his whole body is warning him that he should not confront this creature. The protagonist needs to retreat and think of what to do next. Sai-Hyan, with a smile on her face, walked up to the boss lying on the ground. Elchin, with surprise and a shaking body, looked at her and asked, "Is this really garlic?" She quickly pointed the blade forward with a smirk on her face and said that he did well. Sai-Hyan instantly pierced the detonator in his body with the blade. She looked at him and asked, "Can she let him escape?" The Amorphous, with fear on his face, wondered what to do. He knelt down and thought that most likely the bomb timer had already been activated and attacking her directly would be suicide. The Amorphous should know what skills and strategies the enemy uses. Are her eyes the Space Wanderer Observer gene, or is it a hellish eye? Sai-Hyan said that she had a suggestion. She put her hand on her hip with a smile on her face and said that the protagonist was similar to her, so she would spare his life. On the condition that he serve her. Sai-Hyan, with a smirk on her face looking away, told the Amorphous to become her pet. The protagonist is also a creature that controls genes. She can be a good mistress for him. Sai-Hyan smiled and extended her hand forward, asking him to take her side. The Amorph thought that the superior Sai-Hyan had called him to serve her. The protagonist looked forward in surprise and thought that she wasn't lying, not that she had a reason. The blade on Sai-Hyan's wrist was a Galaran claw. Even its shell couldn't protect it. Not to mention the other abilities she had. The amorphous figure with shaking legs thought that if he honestly obeyed her it would be wise. He walked forward and Sai-Hyan said that this was the right choice. The amoeba told the protagonist not to be afraid because she was here. The protagonist lowered his head and thought that Sai-Hyan didn't know the reason why he liked the amorphous figure. Why did he waste his time on this scary and useless character? Why did people call him an amorphous fan on the internet? It's simple, it's freedom of choice. With this choice, the amorphous figure becomes stronger to infinity. That's why he has such a strong love and his choice is obvious. The protagonist approached Sai-Hyan closer and bowed to her. The amoeba addressed him by his nickname in surprise. Sai-Hyan extended her hand forward with a smile on her face and said that he was a good pet. She instantly clenched her hand in horror while looking forward. The amorphous figure instantly rose and splashed its liquid to the sides. He quickly ran to the side and said in her language so that the amoeba would hold on tighter. She loudly agreed with him. Sai-Hyan, with an ominous smile on her face and blood in her eyes, raised her hand and said what his decision meant. She raised her clenched hand into a fist with a terrifying smile and created a fire around herself, laughing loudly, asked if the amorphous wanted to play. Rays of fiery mana stretched over the protagonist's head. He quickly ran forward and thought that she was definitely stronger than him. The most dangerous enemy he had faced so far. However, the amorphous had fought with other outstanding opponents and always emerged victorious. He would teach her a lesson and prove that fighting is not only about strength. At the same time, Elchin raised his metal hand up. He gritted his teeth and placed his hand on the metal and thought that they were freaks. The boss, with a bloody face, wondered how she dared to betray him. He would make Sai-Hyan beg for death. Elchin looked at the huge wound with the detonator in his body and thought that the device was destroyed. It would be all over if he couldn't get to the engine room in 10 minutes. The boss stood up shaking and wondered if he was really going to die here. They might not make him laugh, he was different from the others. Elchin, standing on the destroyed buildings, thought that it was him. The amoeba sitting in the protagonist's arms asked if his legs hurt. The amorphous one, looking forward with a confident look, said in her language that he was already feeling better. The amoeba asked if it was true. He, squeezing her with his hands, agreed with her. The protagonist, quickly looking forward, thought that Sai-Hyan had the Terra Devil gene with X-ray vision. A surprise attack might not work, and if he hid, she would quickly find him. Besides, she most likely had other abilities besides her eyes. The time to make a decision was limited, and the more the protagonist delayed, the worse. The fact that the amorphous was concerned about the bomb was part of her plan. Maybe Sai-Hyan was expecting him to try to get to the lifeboat. She was going to block the hangar entrance and corner him, so what was she planning? Then Sai-Hyan would try to subdue the amorphous with her overwhelming power. Basically, it was a standard tactic. The protagonist, with an aura emitting from his eyes, ran forward quickly, thinking that he felt like he was facing another player. For now, he should focus on destroying the enemy, not the bomb. He would find information along the way. The problem was that his offensive and defensive abilities were much lower than the enemy's, but there had to be another way. The amorphous looked ahead in surprise and thought that he knew what to do. That thing was in the lab, and maybe the protagonist would be able to turn the tables on him. The psionium, with it, he would be able to use the abilities of the young specimen for a while. The technique Sai-Hyan was using was called Blade Vortex. Galeron's genes include extrasensory abilities. Currently, Amorph has zero resistance to this power. If he became a young individual, he would be able to resist it. Even if she has a Galeron claw, the protagonist's shell should be able to withstand. Amorph, rapidly moving forward, thought that he could also carry out a long-range attack, but it was energy-consuming. The protagonist, clutching an amoeba in his hands, moved forward and thought that this meant he would kill Sai-Hyan as soon as possible. Energy was the last thing he needed to worry about. Amorph said in her language for the amoeba to wait. She, sitting on the ground, looked ahead and asked where he was going. Amorph, moving forward, said in her language that he was going to pick up something. He looked around and thought that he was somewhere here. The protagonist, smirking, thought that here he was. Amorph, looking at Psionium with a serious expression, thought that a notification had appeared in the game. I wonder how this would work in reality. The protagonist took it in his hand and thought that he should know this. The amoeba loudly told him not to do this. The Amorph turned his head back in surprise and asked in her language, "What's wrong?" He looked at the shrunken amoeba and wondered why she was nervous. The protagonist opened the Psionium and thought that he would wait for her to answer, but not now. The Amorph quickly opened his mouth and poured the liquid into it. He opened his eyes wide with an enraged look, with an aura radiating from them, and looked forward. The protagonist, with blue veins protruding on his body, thought that his body was burning with fire. He instantly broke the can of Psionium with his hand. The Amorph, with reddened eyes and huge veins protruding on his body, growled and thought that he was in a lot of pain. He raised his hands and thought that he could not give up. A powerful stream of fire covered his body. The Amorph with sparkling eyes looked forward. The protagonist, with a changed appearance, looked up. The amoeba jumped up and said loudly that it was amazing, he had grown up again. The protagonist looked up with a terrifying look. The Amorph, with a red aura in his eyes, looked forward and thought that he had succeeded. He extended his finger towards the system window that had appeared. The system window notifies that the race is an unidentified hostile cosmic matter. The state is a young individual and his goal is to survive. Special skills related to the body are wings, chitinous shell, renewable energy, paralyzing sting, and so on. Related to superpowers, predator's sense, extrasensory perception, human nature, and resistance to extrasensory power. A type of strengthening physical strength. The protagonist thought that some characteristics had changed. The reinforced exoskeleton was upgraded to a monster exoskeleton. Horns had also grown, they could be used to throw back his enemies or strike. The Amorph, shrouded in blood smoke, looked at his hand. He thought that an organ for launching bone spikes had appeared on his left hand. Its power is equal to that of a plasma pistol, and he can even apply characteristics to it. The Amorphous looked at his hand with his mouth wide open and thought that there was some kind of shield on his body that protected him from psychic power. With it, he could block Galaran's claws. The protagonist looked up and thought that he needed to check how much time was left. In the game, the psionium effect was 5 minutes. He thought that in reality it was about the same. The Amorphous looked ahead with a red aura emitting from his eyes and thought that Saiyan was within the reach of his senses. He had better hurry. The protagonist needs to weaken her before the fight begins. The Amorphous placed his hands on the ground and emitted a powerful stream of red mana and used the communication skill. He thought that 5 minutes was not that long. He should finish everything quickly. At the same time, Saiyan walked down the corridor with a calm look. She looked at the shaking branches on the ceiling in surprise. Green liquid quickly poured out of a large green ball. Saiyan looked at this with confusion. She smirked and looked forward, burning her face with liquid. Saiyan spread her arms out to the sides with a terrifying look and created a stream of fiery mana. A powerful explosion thundered from part of the ship. The amoeba quickly flew up. The protagonist, lowering his hand down, thought that she was coming. He, holding the amoeba with his hand, said in her language for her to hold on tighter, because he was going to run now. The amoeba loudly agreed with him. The Amorph quickly kicked the floor, creating a stream of smoke. He tucked one leg and ran forward. The protagonist thought that Saiyan destroyed the slime with her blade in one blow. He must lure her to the place where the nuclear reactor is. She will not be able to fight at full strength there. Even the slightest touch or wave will cause a nuclear explosion. The Amorph, running along the dark corridor, thought that no matter how many genes Saiyan has, even with them it is simply impossible to survive it. The main character tucked his leg, raised his hand, and thought that another sector. He didn't have time to think, he instantly stopped and looked ahead. Saiyan, smiling, looked ahead surrounded by smoke and asked, "Where is he going?" She pulled the blades out of her hands with a smirk on her face. Amorph, throwing the amoeba aside, thought that anything but that. Saiyan spread her arms out to the sides and sent fiery beams forward. The mana beam hit the Amorphous' body, emitting smoke. The protagonist bent down from the beams hitting his body and made a sound of pain. He looked forward with a red aura in his eyes and thought that this was a demonstration of a claw attack. The Amorphous couldn't recognize this before. Could it be because of the extrasensory organ? Saiyan looked forward in surprise. The protagonist kicked off the ground with his foot, raising a stream of smoke underneath it. He quickly headed towards her with an ominous look. Saiyan waved her hand with a grin on her face. She delivered a powerful blow with her claw to the Amorphous' body. The protagonist raised his head up and made a loud sound of pain. Saiyan looked forward with a smile and raised her hand up, saying that he was faster than before. She quickly raised her leg up and jumped forward. Saiyan tilted her head back with a smile on her face, not getting hit by his attack. She kicked the protagonist's hand, laughed loudly, and said that this was not enough. Saiyan looked down at her body, bound by the Amorphous' tail, in confusion. The protagonist confidently raised his hand, directing the sharp rocks forward. She looked forward with fear in her eyes. Saiyan gritted her teeth, instantly raised her hand, pushing the rocks aside. They stood in a dark room and looked at each other. Saiyan clenched her hand into a fist, saying that this was quite good. She smirked, saying that he had cornered her. Saiyan raised her hands with an ominous look, enveloping herself in powerful mana. The protagonist looked forward in amazement, wondering if she really had red hair. A beam of fiery mana hit his tail. The Amorphous quickly looked at his cut tail. He looked at Saiyan with a bright aura in his eyes. She stood on the cut piece of his tail and asked if he was really trying to increase the distance. Saiyan, with a confident smile and red hair, put her hand on her hip and said that she saw that the Amorphous was familiar with the red mist. The protagonist was becoming more and more interesting. The Amorphous looked ahead and thought that she was definitely not an easy opponent. The red mist was a predator that lived on a planet that resembled a jungle. Its mane emitted a threatening pheromone that caused hallucinations. If she had the red mist gene, she needed to be defeated before the effect of the psionium wore off. The Amorphous with red eyes looked ahead and thought that panicking would do no good. He could only remain calm and wait for the right moment. Saiyan, looking at the protagonist running towards her, said loudly that this was better. The Amorphous approached her with a confident look. Saiyan quickly swung her hand with a blade. The protagonist instantly splashed the liquid from his hand onto her head. He inflicted a wound on her at great speed. Saiyan, enraged, created a powerful stream of mana and said loudly that she was already bored with him. The Amorphous quickly flew to the side. Sai-Hyan gritted her teeth, looked at the sharp stones flying towards her and waved her hand, throwing them aside. The protagonist looked ahead and thought that he seemed to guess what her vulnerability was. She had the makings to match the skills of the players. Unlike them, she had a significant weakness, and that was the inability to use two abilities at the same time. Sai-Hyan, looking ahead, gritted her teeth and said that he was starting to get on her nerves. She could easily kill the Amorphous. The protagonist, with an ominous aura in his eyes, thought that he needed to find out how long it took her to switch between abilities. There had to be a gap, no matter how quickly she did it. The moment when she became vulnerable. The Amorphous, kneeling down, thought that he needed to change his strategy. He quickly jumped forward. The protagonist, with a terrifying look, flew towards Sai-Hyan and thought that he would make it so that she would not be able to act. The world in which the amoeba opened her eyes was cold and oppressive. Some intelligent creatures called this place the seabed. It was her home, a dangerous environment with low temperatures and high pressure. However, she did not think that everything was so bad. There were those who protected her, but they were weak and always had to fear for their lives. Usually, this was exactly how it was. When the amoeba realized that she had a special power, she protected her own kind from predators. After some time, she became the head of the pack, but her life did not change much. Sharing food and sleeping with her pack was the greatest happiness in her life. However, this happiness did not last long. When the amoeba heard the screams of the others, she continued to hope for the best. She hoped that she would be able to fulfill her duties as the head of the pack. The amoeba wanted to protect her loved ones. She thought that she was able to protect everyone, but this was not so. The miracle did not happen, but there was unbearable fatigue. After many years, the leader of the pack, who was unable to fulfill her duties, woke up. The amoeba found herself in a foul-smelling liquid prison. There she watched as everyone she protected was killed. The creature with the animal in its arms called her number 26, and there was no one left except her. At the bottom of hell, she could only pray that someone would come to her aid. If such a person appeared, the amoeba would give the rest of its life for him. Sai-Hyan, enveloped in powerful streams of mana, headed towards the protagonist. She raised her hands up with an angry look and said loudly that she was tired of this. The Amorph raised his hand, quickly throwing stones back. Sai-Hyan crouched down and raised her hands in front of her with blades on them blocking the blow, and loudly said that he did it with his jokes. The protagonist directed his tail towards her with great speed. Sai-Hyan, gritting her teeth, dodged his tail. She swung her hand furiously, cutting his tail with the mana she left behind. The green liquid from his tail splashed the area around. Sai-Hyan, with the green liquid on her body, crouched down, leaning on her hand and made a loud sound. She quickly punched the protagonist's hand with her fist. The Amorphous looked forward and thought that he assumed that she had defensive abilities. He never expected that it was a super strong tungsten goblin alloy. Sai-Hyan punched the protagonist's body with great force, creating a powerful stream of air. She punched his body with great force and loudly said that the ill-mannered animal must be punished. The Amorphous opened his mouth wide, threw his head back and roared loudly in pain. He quickly pushed off the ground with his feet and thought that in order to defeat him, she would need something more. The protagonist, with a terrifying look and a red aura radiating from his eyes, moved his hands towards Sai-Hyan with great speed. He grabbed her body with great force. She, with a frightened look, looked up and loudly asked, "What is this?" The Amorphous, with a stern look, stood among the dark smoke, lifted her body up and thought that she was very heavy. The super strong alloy is similar to a protective suit, but it weighs down the body. The protagonist, with great power, throwing her body forward, thought that he might have a chance. Sai-Hyan, with fury, gritting her teeth, turned her head back and loudly said that he was a freak. She, enveloping her body in bright red lightning, stood in a fighting stance. The Amorphous, standing on the shaking floor, shook and thought that this was very bad. Sai-Hyan, with a terrifying look, raised his hands to the sides and sent powerful streams of fiery mana. The protagonist, covering himself with his hands from the rays of fiery mana, thought that there was still a little left. Liquid from his body splashed in different directions. The Amorphous, with an ominous look, headed forward at great speed and thought that this was his moment. Sai-Hyan, with a smile on her face, jumped to the side, not falling under his attack. She turned her head to the side and laughed loudly and said that he missed. Sai-Hyan looked ahead with a confused look. The protagonist gritted his teeth and thought that he would disappoint her, but he hit the target. From the very beginning, his target was not Sai-Hyan. A powerful stream of air from the hole in the wall broken by the Amorphous burst out. Sai-Hyan, flying back, grabbed the ground with the blades on her hands. She looked back in surprise at the protagonist standing behind her. The Amorphous, with his mouth slightly open, pointed his hand forward and thought that he was waiting for this moment. Sai-Hyan, with fear on her face, looked forward quickly and screamed loudly and said that she would not die here. Her hands with her palms clenched into fists were quickly covered with bulging veins. The protagonist thought that she was forcing herself to activate two skills at the same time, being an instant away from death. The Amorphous had to kill her before it was too late. He aimed many sharp stones in her direction. Sai-Hyan looked at the sharp rocks that were rapidly heading towards her with blood flowing from her eyes. She looked forward with a smirk on her face. The amoeba loudly told her to get away from it. A powerful stream of lightning from the amoeba hit Sai-Hyan's head. She clenched her teeth in rage, looked forward and loudly said what it was. Before she could finish speaking, a sharp rock quickly flew through the mana. Blood gushed out of the huge hole in Sai-Hyan's eye and her body instantly fell to the side. The amoeba loudly asked the Amorphous to help her. She quickly flew to the side. The protagonist grabbed the amoeba and Sai-Hyan with his hands and thought that he would never let them go. He held the amoeba close to him and told her in her language not to let go. She said that she wouldn't do that. The Amorphous, squeezing her with his hands, thought that the psychic energy that just came out of number 26's tentacle must be. He'll think about it next time, but first they need to get out of this place. After a while, Sai-Hyan's feet left a trail of blood behind them. The protagonist looked forward with a red aura in his eyes. He held her body in his hand and dragged Sai-Hyan along the floor. The Amorphous, looking forward, thought that the life support system wouldn't be able to maintain a stable atmosphere inside the ship forever. If someone were here, they would have fixed the problem or manually fixed and stabilized everything. There's almost no one on the ship except the pirates. The protagonist is sure that they don't know what's going on since they're busy hiding from him. The Amorph looked forward with a serious expression while holding the amoeba with part of his body and thought that this ship was finished. The amoeba asked, "What happened to his hand?" The protagonist looked down and made a questioning sound in her language. His hand rose up, changing its shape. The tail rose up, changing its shape. The Amorph looked up, standing in the steam and changing its shape, thought that the effect of the psionium had ended and his previous form had returned, fortunately painlessly. The protagonist looked away and thought that he had hoped that the effect would last longer. The Amorph looked at Sai-Hyan's body with drooling mouth and thought that he had gained something more important. In the game, high-level megacorporation representatives had an average of more than 1,000 genes at their disposal. All of them were genes of rare creatures that were hard to find. Sai-Hyan was not a high-level player, but she had a lot of valuable genes in her body. The protagonist grabbed her body with his hands and looked forward and thought that it was the same as absorbing samples, so he would get a maximum of 3 genes. The Amorph withdrew from his mouth, looked at the bloody hand and thought that even if it was alone, he hoped that it would be the Galeron Claws gene. He opened his mouth wide, sticking his tongue out at Sai-Hyan's head. After a while, the protagonist, holding her body part in his hands, bit off a piece of it. The Amorph looked forward with fear, remembering the explosions. He opened his eyes wide and thought that he had forgotten about the bomb. The protagonist, jumping forward, thought that his predator's instinct told him that there were about 5 minutes left. This was not enough to defuse the bomb. The Amorph was jumping forward rapidly, holding the body and the amoeba in his hands, and thought that he needed to leave this ship. He needed to evacuate quickly on the escape pod. The protagonist needed at least 5 minutes to make it. He definitely couldn't do it. The only way to quickly get there. The Amorph, with a bright aura in his eyes shrouded in smoke, looked at the plasma weapon and thought that this was it. The protagonist quickly grabbed the handle of the weapon with his hand. The amoeba looked at the plasma gun and said loudly that it was sparkling. The Amorph, holding the plasma weapon in his hand, said in her language that it was bright. He extended his hand towards the plasma gun charge and set it to maximum power. The plasma gun, emitting a stream of plasma with sparks, began to increase power. The protagonist raised his weapon and quickly struck with a beam of plasma with sparks. A powerful stream of plasma was directed throughout the ship, emitting a bright light. The Amorph, looking at the amoeba in his hands, said in her language for it to hold on tighter. She loudly agreed with him. The protagonist quickly jumped forward. They flew down into a huge hole shrouded in smoke. The Amorph jumped out of the hole in the ship. He, holding the weapon in his hand, looked back and quickly grabbed the pipe on the ship with his tail. The protagonist, holding everyone in his hands, looked at the starry sky. He headed forward at great speed. The Amorph crawled along the outside of the ship. He quickly looked forward and thought that they were at their destination. The Amorph jumped down quickly, attaching its body parts to the ship. It directed a beam of plasma forward. The plasma punched a hole in the ship, creating steam from its power. The protagonist threw the weapon aside and thanked it. The amoeba said loudly that this was very cool. The Amorph crawled up the wall in the direction of the rushing air. It looked at the capsule and thought that it was an open escape pod. Had someone already tried to escape on it? The protagonist, looking tired, put his hands on the doors of the capsule and thought that this relieved him of unnecessary worries. He told the amoeba in its language to grab onto something. The amoeba agreed with his words. At the same time, Elchin, with a bloody body, said that for a minute he thought he would die right there. He, looking tired, sighing heavily, said that his feelings had returned, but his eye. Elchin didn't finish his sentence, and thought that when one of his hearts was ripped out, his body went into chaos. He almost detonated the bomb while defusing it. There was no way Elchin would let them get away. He set the bomb to detonate automatically, so that it would explode in 10 minutes. Elchin looked ahead with a grin on his face and thought that by then he would have escaped from this ship, and only ashes would be left of them. He looked back with a confused look and thought that it was quite quiet here. Maybe one of them died? Elchin looked away with a serious expression and thought that the one who remained was in danger of death. Yusung raised his hand with a frightened look and looked ahead and asked loudly, "Is that really a pirate?" Elchin looked at him and thought that, judging by the uniform, it must be Captain Yusung. His appearance was very different from the one Saiyan described. He believed that the captain was hiding because he couldn't leave his ship. Later, he crawled out, thinking that the coast was clear. Yusung quickly raised his gun forward and loudly told him not to come closer. The captain, with a shaking body, said loudly that if Elchin twitched, he would shoot him. It was a plasma gun. The pirate, looking forward, asked, was he really going to kill him with this? Why didn't the captain even remove the safety catch while threatening? Yusung looked down with a puzzled expression and asked, what safety catch was he talking about? Elchin quickly pushed him aside with his shoulder. The captain fell to the ground with great speed. The pirate, pointing his gun forward, laughing, said that Yusung was a fool, he was so scared. He called out to the captain and said that the plasma gun didn't have a safety catch. Elchin, with a malicious grin on his face, stood in front of the captain sitting on the floor and said that if there was time, he would kill him, but he didn't have that time. Yusung, with a red face, looking forward, loudly asked for mercy. He, shaking, loudly said that he would do anything, just don't touch him. Elchin, pointing the gun in his direction, said that there was no need for that. He pulled the trigger and said goodbye to the captain. Elchin looked in surprise at the plasma lightning enveloping his body. Yusung closed his eyes, clenched his teeth, and moved his head away from the flying pieces of the pirate's flesh. He looked with horror on his face at the piece of leg with blood squirting out of it. The captain raised his hand with a smile on his face and laughed. He threw his head back with a terrifying smile on his face while kneeling and laughing loudly said that the pirate deserved it. Yusung is a descendant of great giants, and the eldest son in the Samo family. The captain raised his hands up with a joyful look and threw his head back loudly said that he was invincible. A powerful explosion thundered on the ship, illuminating everything around with its light. The capsule quickly shook from the streams of power. The amoeba hit the ceiling and loudly addressed the main character. The Amorph looked at her with a sad look. He looked at the amoeba lying on the floor and asked in its language how it was. The protagonist picked it up and thought that it seemed to have lost consciousness. He put the amoeba on the table and thought that the blow was not strong enough to cause injuries. The Amorph will soon return to normal. The protagonist looked out the window at the pieces of the destroyed ship. He thought that this was the very first place where he set foot in this world. It was time to say goodbye to the research ship, the basis of his growth and evolution. The capsule quickly headed forward from the wreckage of the ship. The Amorph picked up a bottle from the floor and, looking at it, wondered if someone had been drinking here. He quickly sat down at the controls and thought that something was wrong here. He should watch the internal video recordings from this rescue capsule. The protagonist pressed the buttons on the keyboard with his hands. The system window notified that internal video recordings were being played. The Amorph looked at the video recording where Yusung was sitting with a bottle in his hands and thought that it was the captain. Is he still alive? He was hiding here, drinking away his sorrows and waiting for it all to end. Apparently, Yusung noticed when it was over and came out to see what was going on. Was the captain hoping that one of the soldiers would kill the protagonist or that a passing ship would come to his aid? Amorph, pressing the delete button, thought whatever it was none of his business. The system window notifies that internal video recordings have been deleted. The navigation mode is changing to standby mode. Default settings are displayed on the screen. The protagonist looked at the planet and thought that this was one of the planets under the command of a megacorporation. Usually a large army is stationed on them. He should avoid them as much as possible. The Amorph looked at the screen and pressed the buttons with his hand and thought that the closest place from here is it. A huge planet with a city in a capsule hovering in the starry sky. This is a specialized shopping center for TNC. This is a large space colony floating in space. A place where players gather to trade. The Amorph also hunted players here with their unique genetic essence. The Amorph crossed his arms and approached the screen and sighed, thinking that because of this people called him different names. Starting with the cowardly Amorph. The protagonist pressed his fingers on the keyboard and thought, what else could he do if Amorphs were created to do this? The system window notifies that the course has been changed. The destination is a specialized shopping center for TNC. The capsule, enveloped in a bright red light, headed forward at great speed. After some time, the system window notifies that it is switching to autopilot. The time left to stay is 3 hours. The Amorph, putting his hand on the rest of the chair, turned to the side and thought that a colony with different species is an ideal place to get food. He thought as he walked forward, anyway, who would have thought that the amoeba would turn out to be a sea demon? The protagonist, raising his hands over the lying amoeba, looked at it. He thought that they were similar in appearance and habitat, but with a difference in size, and none of them were hostile. Maybe that's why they are the same species. Sea demons have a superpower called Deep Sea Sin. It is capable of driving people crazy. It is similar to the hallucinations of the Red Mist, but can be activated constantly and has a wider range. This is almost as rare as Galaron's Claw. The Amorphous reached out his hand towards the amoeba and thought that this might be his chance. He quickly pulled his hand away and thought that it wasn't so. The protagonist crossed his arms looking at her and thought that even if he ate number 26 there was no guarantee that the predator effect would work. The Amorphous also became very attached to her. He placed his hand on the amoeba and thought that she was good for him. The protagonist does his best to help number 26 until his life is in danger. For now, he will just look after her. The Amorphous looked at Saihyun's corpse. He opened his mouth wide, pulling out his tongue, and thought that it was finally his time to eat this flesh.